We've got some tea leaf reading from the Supreme Court today, with justices seeming to be leaning towards siding with President Trump in a case that could really expand how much power he has as president. The court's hearing arguments today over whether the president can fire a member of the Federal Trade Commission without cause. Okay, whether he can fire somebody from the FTC. So what, right? Why should you care? Well, this is important because the thinking goes this would basically get rid of the concept of agencies like the FTC being independent. It would be a break from this 90-year-old precedent known as Humphrey's executor. Legal seminar, gang, but hang with us here because Chief Justice John Roberts questioned if that precedent actually still makes sense. Listen.
Humphrey's executor is just a dried husk of whatever people used to think it was, because in the opinion itself, it described the powers of the agency it was talking about, and they're vanishingly insignificant.
So here's what just happened today, and honestly, this might be one of the most dangerous moments for American democracy that we've seen in a really long time. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. The Supreme Court heard arguments today in a case that could fundamentally transform how the entire federal government works from top to bottom. I'm talking about Trump versus Slaughter. This case is about whether Trump gets to fire the leaders of independent federal agencies whenever he wants, for any reason he wants, with absolutely no restrictions at all. Think about what that means for a second. Really think about it. Independent federal agencies. These are things like the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. These agencies are supposed to be insulated from political pressure. They're supposed to make decisions based on facts and expertise and evidence, not based on what the president wants. They're supposed to protect consumers. They're supposed to regulate business fairly. They're supposed to keep the economy fair and safe. That's their whole job. That's their whole purpose. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
I want to bring in our Supreme Court reporter, Lawrence Hurley, who's joining us now. Professor Hurley, good to see you. Lay it out for us here, because what's so interesting, setting aside kind of the legal jargon here in super plain English, if the court does side with President Trump here, it would, in essence, go a long way towards giving him that more muscular presidency that he has long sought.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, the plain English part is not so easy when you're dealing with this kind of alphabet soup of federal agencies. But these agencies have huge impacts on people's daily lives. You know, they deal with things like labor relations and they deal with product safety. There's all kinds of obscure agencies that have broad powers, and they were set up by Congress to be independent from the political pressures of the day. And if the president wins this case, that kind of goes away, right? The president has a lot more authority over those agencies, and it might not even be the end of it. There might be more things to come that will make them further under the control of the president and less likely to be protected from those issues of the day.
But Trump is arguing that he should be able to fire the leaders of these agencies whenever he feels like it. No restrictions, no cause needed. If he doesn't like what they're doing, if they're not obedient enough, if they're not loyal enough to him, he can just fire them. And the Supreme Court is actually considering this argument seriously. The court is actually taking this case. The court is actually hearing oral arguments today on whether the president should have this kind of power over these agencies. Let me tell you why this matters and why you should care about this even if you don't usually follow Supreme Court cases or legal matters. Because this is about the fundamental structure of American government. This is about the basic architecture of how our system works. This is about whether Congress gets to create agencies that are independent or whether the president gets to control everything in the executive branch. This is about whether you're going to have impartial regulators protecting you as a consumer or whether you're going to have political operatives in those positions doing whatever the president tells them to do. The case is called Trump versus Slaughter, and it's about Rebecca Slaughter, who is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission right now. Now here's the thing that makes this even more interesting. Trump actually appointed her back in 2018 when he was president the first time. But now he doesn't like her because she's got Democratic ties, and she actually believes in agency independence. She actually thinks the FTC should be independent from the president. She's not just going to do whatever Trump tells her to do. She's not just going to be his puppet, and Trump can't stand that. So Trump is arguing that he should be able to fire her because she's not loyal enough to him. He's arguing that the president should have absolute power to remove the heads of these agencies without any restrictions whatsoever. And the Supreme Court is actually considering this argument. The court is actually taking it seriously. The conservative majority on the court is actually signaling that they might agree with Trump on this. Now here's what's absolutely wild about this situation. In May of 2025, just a few months ago, the Supreme Court issued an unsigned opinion. That means the whole court agreed on it without any one justice putting their name on it publicly. And in that opinion, the court basically said the president has the right to remove executive officers without cause, as long as there are no specific exceptions written into law. And since Congress didn't write in specific exceptions for some of these agencies, well, guess what? The president can just fire them anyway. And Justice Kagan, she's one of the liberal justices on the court, she dissented. She wrote a dissenting opinion. She pointed out that the majority has basically handed full control of these agencies to the president. She said the majority seems eager to overturn the 1935 precedents that were designed to protect agency independence. She's basically saying the conservative majority is dismantling nearly a century of constitutional law that's been protecting these agencies. Think about what that means. Think about the actual implications. If Trump gets this power, if the Supreme Court says Trump can fire agency leaders whenever he wants, then Trump... So what happens to consumer protection? What happens to antitrust enforcement? What happens to environmental protection? What happens to worker safety? All of that goes away if Trump gets to control all these agencies directly with no restrictions. And here's the kicker, the thing that really shows what's happening. Trump has already been firing agency leaders even before the Supreme Court rules on this case. The court has been issuing emergency rulings that allow him to do it anyway. The court has been signaling that they're going to let him do this, so Trump's already taking control of these agencies, and the court is already letting him do it. This is not some theoretical thing that might happen in the future. This is not hypothetical. This is already happening right now. Trump is already taking control of these independent agencies, and the Supreme Court is already letting him do it, even though there are laws against it. And today the court is hearing arguments on whether to make it official, whether to say that Trump has this power permanently, whether to say that this is constitutional. This is one of those moments where you gotta understand what's happening. This is one of those moments where the fundamental structure of American government is being rewritten before our eyes, and most people don't even realize it's happening. Most people are not paying attention to what's going on, but this is huge. This is absolutely huge. Okay, so let's get into what's actually happening with this Supreme Court case, because there's a lot of legal stuff going on and it's complicated, but we need to break it down so you understand what's really at stake here and why it matters so much. So the case is called Trump versus Slaughter, and it's about presidential removal power. That means it's about whether the president can fire people who work in these independent agencies without any restrictions. But Trump is arguing that the Constitution gives him the power to fire anybody who works in the executive branch, including people who run independent agencies. He's saying the Constitution assigns executive power to him, so he should have the power to remove anybody he wants without any restrictions at all. And the Supreme Court is taking this argument seriously and hearing oral arguments. Now the reason this is happening is because of who's on the Supreme Court now. Trump appointed 3 justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Those 3 justices are part of a conservative majority of 6 justices on the court. And that conservative majority has been signaling for a while now that they want to expand presidential power. They want to give the president more control over the executive branch. They want to give the president more authority over government. In May 2025, the Supreme Court issued what's called an unsigned opinion. That means the whole court agreed on it without any one justice signing their name to it publicly. And in that opinion, the court basically said that the president has a right to remove executive officers without cause, subject to specific exceptions in the law. In other words, the default rule is that the president can fire anybody unless Congress specifically passed a law saying he can't fire that particular person. Now that might sound technical and boring, but it's absolutely huge because it shifts the burden in a major way. Before, the burden was on the president to prove he had the right to fire somebody. The president had to show he had the authority. But now the burden is on Congress to prove he doesn't have that right. Congress has to pass a law saying the president can't do it. That's a massive shift in power from Congress to the president. That's a fundamental change in how government works. And Justice Kagan, she's one of the liberal justices on the court, she wrote a scathing dissent. She said the majority has handed full control of these agencies to the president. She said the majority seems eager to overturn 1935 precedents and constitutional law from 90 years ago. She was basically saying the conservative majority is dismantling nearly 100 years of constitutional law that was designed to protect agency independence from political pressure. Now the 1935 precedent she's talking about, that came from a case called Humphrey's Executor versus United States. This is a famous case in constitutional law. In that case, FDR, President Franklin Roosevelt, he tried to fire a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission without cause. He just didn't like the guy, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. The court said Congress has the power to create independent agencies, and the president can't just fire their leaders whenever he wants. That was a major ruling. That ruling basically established the principle that you can have agencies that are independent from presidential control. You can have agencies where the leaders have some protection from being fired just because the president doesn't like them. That principle has been the foundation for how the federal government works for 90 years. It's been central to American government. But now the Supreme Court is saying that principle might be wrong. The Supreme Court is saying the president might have the power to fire these agency leaders without cause. And if the court rules that way, it would overturn 90 years of constitutional law. It would overturn nearly a century of precedent. Now, let's think about what Trump's doing here and why he's doing it. Rebecca Slaughter, the chair of the FTC, Trump appointed her in 2018, but now he doesn't want her anymore because she's not obedient enough. She's not just doing what he tells her to do. She actually believes in agency independence. She actually thinks the FTC should make decisions based on facts and expertise, not based on what the president wants. So Trump is trying to fire her from the FTC. And because there's a law that says the president can't fire the FTC chair without cause, without a good reason, Trump is going to the Supreme Court and saying that law is unconstitutional. He's saying the president should have the power to fire her without any reason at all. And here's what's wild about this. Trump has already been firing agency leaders even before the Supreme Court rules on this case. Trump has already been taking action to remove people from these agencies without following the law. And the Supreme Court has been letting him do it by issuing emergency rulings. The court has been allowing Trump to proceed even though there are laws saying he can't do that. So basically, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court is already signaling that they're going to let Trump do this. They're already letting him remove agency leaders without following the law, and now they're hearing arguments on whether to make it official, whether to say that Trump has this power and the laws restricting it are unconstitutional. Now think about what this means for how the government works going forward. Right now, the FTC is supposed to be independent. That means the chair of the FTC makes decisions based on what's good for consumers and what's good for the economy overall. The chair doesn't just follow orders from the president. The chair uses expertise and makes independent judgments based on facts. But if Trump gets the power to fire the FTC chair whenever he wants, then the next person to lead the FTC is going to be somebody who's totally loyal to Trump, somebody who will do whatever Trump tells them to do, somebody who will drop independent judgment and just follow orders. And that's not good for consumers. That's not good for protecting people from corporate abuse. That's not good for antitrust enforcement. And it's not just the FTC, it's all these other agencies too. If Trump gets this power, then he gets to control the Environmental Protection Agency. He gets to control the Securities and Exchange Commission. He gets to control the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He gets to control all these agencies that are supposed to be protecting people and making sure the economy is fair. So what happens to environmental protection if Trump controls the EPA? What happens to worker safety if Trump controls OSHA? What happens to food safety if Trump controls the FDA? What happens to consumer protection if Trump controls the FTC and the CFPB? The answer is that all of that goes away. Or at least it gets turned completely upside down. Instead of these agencies protecting consumers and the environment, they become tools for Trump to use to help big corporations and his friends and hurt his enemies. And here's the thing that makes this even worse and more dangerous. Trump is not the only president who's going to have this power if the Supreme Court rules his way. Every future president is going to have this power. So if a Democratic president gets elected in the future, that president is going to be able to fire agency leaders too. That president is going to be able to control these agencies directly. So this is not just about Trump. This is about fundamentally changing how the federal government works for everybody, forever. This is about taking power away from Congress and giving it to the president. This is about making these agencies political tools instead of independent bodies that make decisions based on expertise and facts and the law. And the Supreme Court is essentially saying that's constitutional. The Supreme Court is saying the president should have this power. The Supreme Court is dismantling the whole system of checks and balances that has been in place for 90 years. That's the real issue here. Alright, so let's break this down into the actual pieces that matter, because there's a lot happening here, and we need to focus on what really counts and what really means something for your life. First thing, if Trump wins this case at the Supreme Court, he gets to control independent federal agencies directly. This is huge. This is absolutely huge for his power. This means Trump gets to decide who runs the FTC. Trump gets to decide who runs the EPA. Trump gets to decide who runs the SEC. Trump gets to decide who runs all these agencies that are supposed to be protecting consumers and regulating business and making the economy fair. And because Trump gets to pick these people and can fire them whenever he wants without cause, he's going to pick people who are totally loyal to him. He's going to pick people who will do exactly what he tells them to do. He's going to pick people who don't believe in agency independence. He's going to pick people who will use these agencies to help Trump's friends and hurt Trump's enemies and help big corporations. That's not how the government is supposed to work. That's not how these agencies are supposed to function. These agencies are supposed to be staffed with experts who make decisions based on facts and expertise and law, not based on what the president wants or what helps the president. But if Trump wins this case, that's all going to change completely. Second thing, this affects antitrust enforcement and corporate regulation in a major way. The FTC is responsible for antitrust enforcement. The FTC is responsible for breaking up monopolies and making sure big companies don't abuse their power. The FTC is responsible for going after big tech companies like Amazon and Google if they're abusing their market power and hurting consumers. But if Trump controls the FTC directly, that's all going to change dramatically. Trump has made it very clear that he's friendly with big business, so consumers are going to lose out. Small businesses that can't compete with monopolies are going to lose out. The whole competitive marketplace is going to be undermined and unfair. And it's all because Trump gets to control the FTC and can fire the chair whenever he wants without any restrictions. Third thing, this is about the broader structure of American government and whether Congress gets to have any power at all in the system. Right now, Congress can pass laws that say certain agencies are supposed to be independent. Congress can create agencies and say the president can't just fire the people who run them for any reason. That's Congress's power. That's part of the system of checks and balances that's supposed to keep any one person from having too much power. But if the Supreme Court rules that the president can fire anybody in the executive branch whenever he wants, then Congress loses that power. Congress can't create independent agencies anymore. Congress can pass all the laws it wants, but the president can just ignore them and fire whoever he wants anyway. Congress becomes powerless. Congress becomes essentially meaningless. So this is about the balance of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch. This is about whether Congress gets to have any say in how the government works, or whether the president gets to control everything. And the Supreme Court is essentially saying the president gets to control everything. Now, let's think about the practical implications of this ruling, if it happens. Trump has already shown that he's willing to fire people who don't agree with him. Trump has already shown that he's willing to replace career government officials with loyalists who will do whatever he tells them to do. If the Supreme Court gives Trump this power officially, then Trump is going to use it extensively. Trump is going to replace the head of the FTC with somebody who will stop antitrust enforcement against big tech companies. Trump is going to replace the head of the EPA with somebody who will roll back environmental regulations and stop enforcing clean air laws. Trump is going to replace the head of the SEC with somebody who will stop enforcement against corporate fraud and financial crimes. Trump is going to replace the head of the SEC with somebody who will stop consumer protection enforcement. And all of this is legal if the Supreme Court rules Trump's way. All of this is constitutional if the court says the president has the power to fire these people without cause and without any restrictions. Now you might be thinking, well, what about the laws that say these agencies are supposed to be independent? What about the laws that say the president can only fire these people for cause? Well, those laws become meaningless if the court rules Trump's way. Those laws become basically toilet paper. The president can just ignore them and fire whoever he wants anyway, because the Supreme Court is essentially saying that the constitutional power of the president to remove executive officers trumps any law Congress passes. Congress can pass a law saying the president can only fire the FTC chair for cause, but the Supreme Court is saying the president has the constitutional power to remove the FTC chair without cause, and the Constitution is higher than the law. The Constitution trumps any statute Congress passes. So that's what's really happening here at a fundamental level. The Supreme Court is saying the president's constitutional powers override any law Congress passes. The Supreme Court is saying the president is basically a king who can do whatever he wants in the executive branch. And this comes at a really crucial moment in Trump's presidency right now. Trump is trying to remake the federal government from top to bottom. Trump is trying to fire thousands of government employees as part of something called RIFs, which stands for reductions in force. Trump is trying to clean out the bureaucracy and replace career government officials with Trump loyalists who will be obedient. This Supreme Court case is just part of that larger project. If Trump wins this case, it gives him even more power to remake the federal government in his image. It gives him even more power to replace independent officials with loyalists. It gives him even more power to politicize the entire federal bureaucracy. And that's dangerous for our country. That's really dangerous for democracy, because one of the things that makes democracy work is the idea that there are institutions that are independent from political pressure. There are institutions that make decisions based on facts and expertise and law, not based on what the politician in power wants. And this Supreme Court case is essentially dismantling that whole system. So what are the consequences if Trump wins this case? Well, you're going to see the federal government become completely politicized. You're going to see career government officials being replaced with Trump loyalists who will follow orders. You're going to see government agencies using their power to help Trump's friends and hurt Trump's enemies. You're going to see the end of the idea that government agencies should be independent and impartial. And once that happens, you can't put it back in the box. Once you establish the principle that the president gets to control all these agencies directly, that's how it's going to be for every future president forever. So you're not just looking at Trump controlling these agencies. You're looking at a fundamental change in how the federal government is going to work for decades and decades to come. That's why this case matters so much. That's why this is one of the biggest cases the Supreme Court is hearing right now. Because it's not just about whether Trump gets to fire Rebecca Slaughter from the FTC. It's about the entire structure of American government. It's about whether Congress gets to have any power at all. It's about whether the president becomes essentially a king who controls everything in the executive branch without any checks or balances. And the Supreme Court is signaling that they're probably going to rule Trump's way on this. The conservative majority is probably going to give Trump this power, and that's going to be a disaster for democracy and for checks and balances in America going forward. Next time, we're going to dive into what's happening with Trump's plan to fire thousands of government employees and remake the entire federal workforce in his image. Because this FTC case is just the legal cover Trump needs to do what he's already planning to do anyway. That's coming up next, and it's going to get messy.